Okay, this is Mac Bolin, and tonight I'm doing a podcast on the Vietnam War, and I'm going to broaden the scope to include Cambodia and Laos because it's all connected. Now, the reason I'm doing this really has to do with a video I saw recently on YouTube from a guy who's a liberal troll by the name of Tim Horn. Posted a video, claimed it's based on historical facts, blah blah blah, researched, etc. Now, to be fair, I actually watched this with an open mind, and after I saw his video, it was pretty much childish, obscenity laced, full of half truths, and pretty much a obscenity laced diatribe. Uh, then, for some reason, he went away from his Vietnam War commentary and went towards Iraq and Afghanistan. And at that point, he went totally off the cliff on the Middle East. It was absurd. It was nonsense. I felt compelled after seeing it and responding on his site to post a rebuttal because it basically degenerated into total nonsense. Now, to start off, I will list sources, unlike he did, because he talked about how his video was based on facts and history, and all he did was basically provide historical background but no facts, and mostly relied on half truths and nonsense. And I mean, it basically was a wreck. So right off the top, I'll say, although I did not serve in Vietnam, I grew up during the entire phase when U.S. involvement was in Vietnam. Also, I did plenty of research. I was a history major, and that would include my studies towards a BA at Methodist University. And most importantly, firsthand information from Vietnam veterans while I was in the service and guys who actually were in 5th Special Forces Group, Ranger companies, and B-52 Recon, participated in the Sante raid, of which several I've met, and members of the MACV SOG. And if you don't know what that is, by all means, look it up online. So without any further ado, bear with me. I'm going to take my time here. I'm going to go slow, and I'm going to try and lay all of this out, unlike the moron who posted his basically liberal-inspired rant, which was devoid of any facts. And let's start off with the background. Okay, post-World War II. Now, prior to World War II, what is known as French Indochina was a colony, and it was controlled by France. Then, of course, during World War II, it was invaded and taken over by Japan and became part of the Japanese Empire. But after World War II, France tried to, reestablish themselves in what was known as French Indochina. Now, they were suffering a severe hangover after World War II. They were weakened, and things pretty much for France started to fall apart. And I could mention Algeria too, which they eventually, even though they won the Battle of Algiers, eventually ended up vacating. And then the French Indochina, the Indochina War, in which France was actually lost, insurgencies sprang up and culminated in 1954 in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which was a defeat. And upon the exit of France from Vietnam and the basically the loss at Dien Bien Phu ended up in the Geneva Accords in 1954, which kind of turned into an interesting situation. Now, the Viet Minh defeated France. France bailed. Now, after their exit, it went to the UN. You ended up with the Geneva Accords, and the country was split in two. Now, much like what happened at the, it was, like at the end of the Korean War, which was a inconclusive outcome, country split in half. Pretty much the same thing happened in Vietnam. So you ended up with a communist North and a democratic South. Now, the problem was there was no real agreement between the two sides. Now, Ho Chi Minh, who led the Viet Minh and pushed for a negotiation for a unified Vietnam, never really was in agreement with the Geneva Accords. They allowed a portion of time where there was free travel, and ironically, tons of people fled the north and headed south. Why? Because they didn't want to be under communist rule. No kidding. And the forces in South Vietnam, which supported communism, and I will kind of eventually explain the whole background as far as why we even got involved in the first place later on. But they feared communism. They did not want to be under communist rule. And literally hundreds of thousands of people fled North Vietnam to head south. Now, when the Geneva Accords were brought up, it was a temporary solution, and there were going to be supposedly elections that would eventually lead to the reunification of Vietnam. So I'm going to just, again, go back briefly. Okay, First Indochina War, 1941, Viet Minh, Communist, Nationalist Liberation Movement under Ho Chi Minh. Again, after the end of World War II, defeated French and Vietnam loyalists in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Now, Ho Chi Minh had always, had that vision of Vietnam being communist. He was supported by both China and Russia. Now, during a 300-day period of free movement, almost 1 million people from the North, Catholics, etc., people who are ethnic Vietnamese, fearing persecution, fled North Vietnam and headed south. That's right. And this was a shock to the North because these people didn't want to be under communism. Now, again, that's something you will never read when most people talk about the history of Vietnam, because it's one of those inconvenient facts that they try to hide. Now, to be fair, and like I said, I'm going to go on both sides of this. Admittedly, I am biased, but the point is, these people did not want to be under the thumb of North Vietnam rule, went to South Vietnam, but South Vietnam at the time ended up in basically a mess. Now, the pro-Hanoi Viet Cong began a guerrilla campaign back in the late 1950s. Now, Diem took over the government eventually in South Vietnam. Now, Diem was corrupt. He was an idiot. And eventually, the U.S. pulled their support for him. He was assassinated in a coup in 1963. And after that was pretty much chaos, which allowed the communist insurgency to gain a lot of ground. So if you go all the way back early, and again, you have to understand Cold War politics. Why did the U.S. get involved? To prevent communist expansion. So during this time period, go back to 1961, Cuban Missile Crisis. The threat of the spread of communism in Soviet Russia during the Cold War was an actual threat. So when Kennedy originally got the United States involved in Vietnam, that's what the purpose was, to prevent the spread of communism. And make no mistake, people will tend to vilify the United States and what we did during the Cold War. But again, the ignorant jackasses will totally ignore everything that Russia and China were doing. And I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but just briefly note, let's take, for instance, Chile. Everybody will vilify the U.S. and Pinochet in Chile because, he was a absolutely corrupt, violent son of a bee, but totally ignore the fact that the guy he replaced in the coup, Allende, was a Soviet puppet and was just as bad. So I would say, folks, get a grip. Know both sides of the story. Don't run off at the mouth before you know all the facts. Okay, so back to Vietnam. Now, our involvement while Kennedy was president was limited. And his plan was containment, and he basically, and you'll hear the term domino effect quite often, which, said, okay, well, the spread of communism into French Indochina may eventually lead to the fall of all these countries. And when they were partitioned, you ended up with a Vietnam with a DMZ that was declared. And as I mentioned before, in the south, in the north and the south, much like Korea, which actually is a somewhat valid comparison. So the other countries, Laos and Cambodia, were also struggling at the same time. Fallout from colonialism, exit of power like France, but basically the entire region was devolved into chaos. Now, to be fair, again, I will mention on the U.S. side, we'll talk about the beginning of our involvement under Kennedy, which was limited. Advisors, I mentioned before, the MAC-VSOG, Military Advisory Command, Region 5, Special Observation Group. And the way the war, the way our involvement began was limited. Now, had JFK not been assassinated, the escalation in Vietnam may never have occurred. He realized the corruption within the South Vietnamese government, and who knows? You know, and again, this is my opinion. He might have pulled the U.S. out completely and said, hey, you know, this isn't worth getting involved in. So let's talk about kind of the key event, the 1964 Tonkin Gulf incident. Okay, the first incident, which occurred on August 2nd, which was an attack on the USS Maddox, which was conducting operations and attacked by Vietnamese torpedo boats. They returned fire. There's controversy involving that incident, but it's obvious that incident actually did occur. The problem is the second supposed incident on August 4th, which by now has been pretty much proven as a hoax and something that was fabricated and used to, I guess, for lack of a better term, support the escalation of the Vietnam War and our participation by Lyndon B. Johnson, a Democrat. And it's funny because a lot of times, you know, you'll hear people talk about Vietnam and they'll talk about Nixon and Republicans, but won't realize the fact that we got involved initially by a Democrat president, JFK, who, given the politics of the time of the Cold War, made a determination, which I agree with 100%, versus the twisted escalation by Lyndon B. Johnson, which threw a ton of troops in, but with no real goal or actual idea of how to prosecute the war. So if you want to blame anybody about our massive commitment in Vietnam, blame the Democratic Party, because that's particularly Johnson who got us overwhelmingly involved in the beginning, and it was a Republican, Nixon, who got us out. Now, some of what he did was right, and some of what I think he did was wrong, but I'll get to that later. So, what Vietnam evolved into, because there was still a draft, it turned into a PR war. Now, the Vietnamese were never, ever able to gain military success against U.S. forces. And like I said in the video, this bozo that I'm rebutting to said something that the U.S. couldn't fight a guerrilla war, which is total nonsense. And I will be immediately point out the fact that he kind of missed the whole thing, like the 1968 Tet Offensive. It was a total disaster for both the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong militarily. They got clobbered. And one of those little things which people love to point out, because you'll always hear in the U.S. press how they vilified Americans for our we did this, we did that wrong, and you'll hear Lieutenant Calley and the My Lai massacre. But they never mention the Hue massacre during the 1968 Tet Offensive, when the NVA literally slaughtered 3,000 people in Hue. Where's the outrage? Where was the press on that? Never saw it. So in a sense, the Vietnam War was kind of like the first representation of fake news in the U.S. media. It was an unpopular war. And while the North Vietnamese were getting their butts kicked literally on the battlefield, they were winning a PR war. And that's really what drove the Vietnam War. There was a draft on at the time. And part of that is what made the Vietnam War unpopular, because, quite frankly, people didn't want to get drafted and go fight in Vietnam. Right or wrong, regardless, they didn't want to go fight, period. And to be fair, again, I'm going to mention two sides of this, because the draft in the Vietnam War was a poor man's, so to speak, war. People who had the resources, who had the pull, who had the connections, were able to avoid the draft. The draft turned into a very unfair measure. And, you know, yeah, some people were lucky enough to end up being stationed in Germany, but most people who were drafted ended up with that 2-year tour going to Vietnam. Now, again, to go to the other side, guys that I had the fortunate opportunity to serve with in the military were guys who enlisted, who volunteered and went and fought in Vietnam, 2, 3, 4 tours, were involved in numerous combat operations, and don't fall into the category of the, well, you know, I don't like to devolve into name calling, but the pieces of shit that basically did everything they could to distance themselves from any involvement in the draft or the Vietnam War. And now I will not include people who served in the National Guard or the Reserves, because the National Guard and Reserves were deployed to Vietnam. They served. This is not lumping them in the same category of the people who dodged the draft openly or sought to find deferments and avoid the conflict altogether. Okay, again, I'm saying I'm going to put this into perspective, and I'm going to go both sides. Even though I'm biased, I'm still going to prevent both sides. Now, the war obviously was very unpopular here in the U.S. People protested, and, you know, we talk about, well, how on earth, when the U.S. is literally kicking North Vietnam's butt militarily, could end up in all this failure? Well, again, I say it was a public relations assault by North Vietnam, which was successful. And I'll go right off the bat, one of the most glaring and most embarrassing moments was when Jane Fonda, treasonous bitch, went over to North Vietnam to go visit American POWs who were held at the Hanoi Hilton. And again, all of those of you who want to vilify Americans in the Vietnam War, go read the book Hanoi Hilton or 5 Years to Freedom and realize the abuse that American POWs suffered at the hands of the Vietnamese. And yet, where was the outrage over that? Why were none of them brought up on war crime trials? And I'm talking about actual torture, not the BS that some of these pussies talk about, enhanced waterboarding technique. You know, they talk about waterboarding, which is nothing more than a harsh interrogation technique. I went through it and it was a joke. And when I went through SEER training, I had a lot worse things done to me than waterboarding. So first of all, you know, and again, I don't want to get into a rant, but you know what? Shut the fuck up if you don't know what you're talking about, and if you don't know what the difference is between interrogation and actual torture. Because I'll tell you what, if you read what our POWs endured in Vietnam, that was torture. That was real torture. And I'm talking about beatings to the point where a guy like Ed Kobiel actually had his eye popped out of his socket because he was beat so hard. Cuban and Russian interrogators who purposely, you know, selected individuals, and it was brutal. So again, I say, know the truth. If you don't, just shut up. You know, if you don't know the difference, shut up. So fast forward now. Basically, during the Johnson administration, we ended up with a stalemate. You know, there was no progress being made. He decided not to run. Nixon won the election. Now, Nixon took a little bit different approach. While we still didn't get the kind of response we needed, at a certain point, he started to authorize more aggressive operations. I'll point out straight off Ivory Coast. Those who are not familiar, Operation Ivory Coast was probably one of the most ballsy operations ever authorized. It was meant to rescue American POWs held in North Vietnam. This is also known as the Sante Raid. Special Forces soldiers were specifically recruited, and they trained to pull off this operation. Now, the reason I point this out, it's significant because it demonstrated our ability to actually operate within North Vietnam. And while the mission didn't succeed in rescuing prisoners because they were moved and there were some mistakes made, but it ended up in that we successfully penetrated North Vietnamese airspace. One of the helicopters with the assault team missed the actual objective of a prison site and landed in a training facility and managed to wipe out what turned out to be probably, we'll never know for sure, Soviet, maybe even Cuban cadre that were training North Vietnamese. And, who knows, the follow-up, many people say, the Soviets evidently sucked up the loss because they totally wiped out everybody. The entire operation, in the sense of it didn't accomplish its ultimate mission, but there were no loss of U.S. lives. We penetrated North Vietnamese airspace, and they got out safe as well. So when a lot of people say, oh, well, we weren't successful. Now, I'm going to go more again into the guerrilla war aspect of this. Nixon, at a certain point, decided, enough's enough, and he instituted a massive bombing campaign. Now, our bombing campaigns included Laos and Cambodia, and I'm going to speak on that more because of the way that the North Vietnamese were using both those countries to support their war effort. Rolling Thunder was authorized, and at a point, the North Vietnamese were beat. They were beat. They were getting their butts kicked. They were, at that point, driven to the Paris peace talks because of our success. Now, at that point, you thought, okay, well, it's over. We have peace. But then came the problem of how would the U.S. support the peace accords. Now, we started to draw down, and again, I point to what happened here in the U.S. because I say again, the PR campaign by North Vietnam was the simple, most successful thing that they were able to pull off. And I point to, again, Jane Fonda's trip, 1968 Democratic National Convention, protests broke out, riots broke out. And there were actually Vietnam veterans against the war. There were fatal shootings at Kent. You could go on. And starting in 1973, we had the Paris Peace Accords. But to be honest, it was all really based on the U.S. commitment to honor and support that, because any idiot who followed the entire journey of the Vietnam War would know that North Vietnam would never, ever, ever ultimately honor the Paris Peace Accords. Now, they were signed on 27 January 1973, and it effectively ended the direct U.S. involvement in the war. Ceasefire was declared, prisoners of war were released, the territorial integrity was recognized, and you thought, okay, well, idiots thought, okay, well, that's it, you know. And then, of course, two years later, and this is where it really all started to come apart. And I mentioned this, and I'm going to go to Cambodia and Laos because it all came apart at the same time. And when Kennedy first involved the U.S. in the Vietnam War, again, I mentioned the domino effect. And what eventually happened is the North Vietnamese Army, which eventually became the Vietnamese Army, literally just became the tool of Soviet policy in Southeast Asia. Because when they re-invaded South Vietnam, the U.S. did nothing to prevent it. And I'll say this straight off. Had we stationed troops and defended South Vietnam like we did South Korea, they would never have done it. They would never have invaded South Vietnam. But when they came back in December of 1974, literally South Vietnam and the South Vietnam Army, without the U.S. Army backing it, was nothing. And by April of 1975, the Saigon fell. It was a disaster for them. It was an embarrassment for the U.S. The U.S. bailed, and eventually, you know, if you want to use the right word, they abandoned South Vietnam. Now, speaking about the North Vietnamese, they immediately purged the Vietnamese military of Chinese and anybody, Montagnards, anybody who was not ethnic Vietnamese. Now, I'm going to go and kind of go a little sideways here because, again, people talk about what the U.S. did, and I heard the bozo and his video mention that the U.S. couldn't fight a guerrilla war, which is total baloney. Let me talk about the Montagnards, also known as, Montagnard means basically people of Central Highlands or mountain people, also known as the Daga, people who were oppressed by the Vietnamese, and the U.S. actually used an ethnic group. Now, they're not ethnic Vietnamese. They're indigenous folks, and they were trained successfully by Special Forces operations in camps to fight the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, and successfully. And they were kicking butt. I mean, they were beating the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese's butt. They were actually used, and again, you know, stuff you never read in the U.S. media, or probably never even bothered to look up online or read about, but they were a minority, and the U.S. used them, and they were successful. They were very successful, but because of that success, in 1967, the Viet Cong slaughtered over 200 of them in the village of Dak Son. Never read about that either, did you? And that was that was revenge for their support of South Vietnam. Now, come 1975, these people bailed and fled to Cambodia after the fall of Saigon because they knew, you know, the North Vietnamese were gonna butcher them. That was their way. many of the people were resettled in the U.S. And again, something that nobody realizes, in Greensboro, North Carolina, the largest population of Montagnards or ethnic Digar, whatever you want to call them, live in the U.S. That's a fact. So now let's change gears here and go to Cambodia. Okay. Like Vietnam, when the uprising took place and French Indochina was given independence, Cambodia became a separate country. Now, unfortunate for Cambodia, the Mekong Delta was given to Vietnam. And that's something that's significant because it's something that Cambodians, even in the days of Khmer Rouge, never kind of took well. Now, when the Vietnam War started and went into full swing, Cambodia supposedly took a position of neutrality, and they were still ruled by the King Norodom Sihanouk, and he kind of tried to stay neutral, but the fact is he still allowed the Vietnamese communists to use Cambodia. He allowed them to move through his country, and a lot of Cambodians didn't like it. And a lot of people, obviously, in the U.S. who were in the know didn't like it either. And they said, hey, you know what? Stop this or we're going to intervene. And they actually offered him a chance to allow the U.S. to conduct airstrikes. And he kind of hemmed and hawed. And then when it happened, he went back on it and he started to whine and say, you know, he opposed any operations by the U.S. But basically, it didn't matter in the end. And the North Vietnamese couldn't care less what he was going to say. They were going to continue to operate within. And they actually, again, I'm going to go back to the moron video I'm rebutting, because he mentions invasions by the U.S. into Cambodia, and I'm going to totally wipe that out in a few minutes here. Okay. The Khmer Rouge, which was a communist movement. Now, they were gaining ground, but the irony is, of course, they were supported by the North Vietnamese. And in 1970, Sihanouk was ousted by a military coup when he was out of the country. Now, people are going to say, oh, the U.S. was involved, and that's baloney, because that has never, ever, ever been proven. In fact, the actual outcome of this was a new regime that tried to toss out the communists, and they kind of gained political support of the U.S., but the North Vietnamese Viet Cong forces supported the Khmer Rouge, and from 1970 to 1972, operated at will within Cambodia. Now, come 1973, and the U.S. during this time period, towards the end, from 1969 to 1973, the U.S. finally, instituted a bombing campaign, and quite frankly, in my opinion, I thought it was a little bit over the top. But instituted a bombing campaign directed at North Vietnamese presence in Cambodia. Now, the North Vietnamese were gaining control of Cambodian territory. And the idiot whose video I'm rebutting says that the U.S. invaded Cambodia. Okay, well, maybe I'm splitting hairs here, but an incursion by the U.S. into Cambodia to destroy North Vietnamese bases, I don't really consider an invasion. On the other hand, let's go all the way to 1978 in the invasion by the Vietnam Army to depose the Cambodian government. That's an actual invasion. So anyway, back to Cambodia, which obviously was affected by the Vietnam War, and Richard Nixon authorized a incursion into Cambodia. He authorized a bombing campaign. But the bottom line is the Khmer Rouge, backed by North Vietnam, eventually took power in Cambodia. The CPK, which were Vietnamese trained communists, eventually took control. There was an invasion. They ended up, and literally, I'd bring back 1975. Come New Year's Day, communist troops launched an offensive, and right around the same time frame, we talk about the fall of Saigon in April, just 5 days after the U.S. bailed and evacuated Cambodia, they took control of Cambodia and installed the Khmer Rouge. Now, the Khmer Rouge, and of course, this has been much talked about in the media, the Khmer Rouge, which were supported by Vietnam and took control, led by Pol Pot, changed the country to the Democratic Kampuchea, and they basically instituted a purge. And if you ever saw the movie The Killing Fields, you probably saw a lot of it. Literally hundreds of thousands died. And it wasn't just, ethnic minority groups. It was Cambodians. It was a horrific event. And eventually, a lot of these people were brought up on war crimes and tried by the UN. But the fact remains that this was a part of the Vietnam War and the fallout. Ironically, in 1978, because the Khmer Rouge, which I mentioned before about the Mekong Delta, started raiding into Vietnam. And their border raids sparked a response. And again, 1978, Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion and deposed the Khmer Rouge. Most people probably have no knowledge of that, and it's probably never brought up. But again, part of what we would call the domino effect, where Vietnam decided, they decided and moved in and took control. Now, as things began to wind down, there was a government in exile, and again, Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union, which had taken control of the country, faced opposition. And because of what happened with the Khmer Rouge, a lot of they actually lost the public relations battle. Now, a settlement was agreed on. Peace efforts began in 1989. And in 1991, a peace settlement was agreed. The UN was given a mandate and enforced a ceasefire. And in 1993, the guy named before, Norodom Sihanouk, was restored as the king of Cambodia. Now, they were a constitutional monarchy, and he was really more of a figurehead, but they were brought to become a multi-party democracy. And all the way in 2010, we had war crimes trials against the Khmer Rouge. Many of them went to trial, died in jail. Unfortunately, Pol Pot lasted all the way until 1998, which was a damn shame. Son of a bitch probably should have had his head cut off many years ago, but that eventually ended the communist regime and control in Cambodia. So now let's go to Laos. Laos, also involved in this conflict. They were part of French Indochina. They also gained independence, but they also devolved towards communist nature. And for those who don't know, there was the Pathet Lao, and they were backed by militarily by the NVA and the Viet Cong and the Soviet Union. So again, I want to bring the facts up. While people may poo-poo the U.S. and our involvement in Vietnam, make no mistake, the Soviet Union was fully involved in all of this and pushing communism in Southeast Asia, but generally ignored by the press and by idiots who don't know the truth. So, again, I go back to the Pathet Lao. Now, Laos in itself was a key part in the Vietnam War because the Vietnamese army was using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to resupply and move through Laos into Vietnam. And again, the U.S. instituted a bombing campaign, and I'll say again, I thought, like in Cambodia, probably over the top, the use of cluster bombs, and in both countries, in Laos and Cambodia, to this day, there is still a ton of unexploded ordnance in those countries that still maim and kill civilians to this day. So, talk about the Pathet Lao, and I'm going to talk about, again, the in rebuttal to the idiot comment about the inability of the U.S. to fight a guerrilla war. The U.S. was able to train and lead a guerrilla army in Laos, and this consisted again of an oppressed people, the Hmong, and they were very successful in fighting the Pathet Lao. They were very successful in interdicting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Again, not something you're going to read about. Now, when, as I mentioned before, you had the fighting going on between 1964 and 1973 and the bombing, but when we pulled out of Vietnam, also in 1975, the Vietnam People's Army, backed by the Soviet Union, invaded and overthrew the Lao government. So again, while people talk about U.S. involvement, I bring back the point that the Vietnam Army became the instrument of Soviet policy in Southeast Asia. Now, they overthrew the Lao government, forcing the king to abdicate. He died in prison. Thousands of Laotians died during the Civil War. And after taking control of the country, again in 1975, the domino effect, which Kennedy predicted and many others predicted, which a lot of people laughed at, came to reality. It happened. And communists took control of Laos. Now, an interesting point in all this, Vietnam, stationed forces in Cambodia and in Laos. In 1979, the People's Republic of China came into a dispute with Vietnam. And a lot of this was based on their actions in these countries. And while Vietnam was clearly in bed with the Soviet Union, China actually went so far as to launching a punitive incursion into Vietnam in 1979 and attacked in northern Vietnam, fought, and then retreated shortly after that. Now, the U.S. eventually resettled close to 250,000 Laotian refugees from Thailand, and this included 130,000 ethnic Hmong. And I bring this up again because people talk about U.S., talk about what we did, but never, ever mention the Vietnamese persecution, the communist persecution of indigenous peoples like the Hmong, like the Montagnards. And I bring this up because it's important to note, and it's something that's never covered. So, kind of tying us all together, let's move towards some kind of a conclusion. And I want to address some of the comments made by the idiot who posted his video saying that the Vietnam War was unwinnable. Baloney. Now, let me explain. I'm going to say this. Could the U.S. have won the Vietnam War? Well, first of all, I'm going to say we successfully defended South Korea against North Korea and the Chinese invasion. Now, that war has never actually been concluded, and to this day, we maintain a presence in South Korea. North Korea is obviously still a threat and run by lunatics. And we faced far superior forces there than we did in Vietnam. Now, had we left a force to defend South Vietnam, a sizable force to protect South Vietnam, like we did in South Korea, North Vietnam would have never invaded to try and knock off South Vietnam, but we abandoned them. Now, I say again, could the U.S. have won the Vietnam War? I will say, in my opinion, absolutely. And before people listening to this freak out, and I'm sure there'll be disagreement, I'll explain. And to follow that up, I'm going to explain what the more important questions are regarding that and why that is a moot point. Okay, could we have beaten North Vietnam? Absolutely. And I'll even tell you how we could have done it. And simply, okay, give me the 18th Airborne Corps, 1st Infantry Division, all the Air Force and Special Operations Forces assets, and the 1st Marine Division. Okay, here's how we do it. Start off with a continued bombing campaign, and 2 days prior to the main operation, cross the DMZ with the 24th Mechanized ID and head towards Hanoi with the 1st Infantry Division in support behind. Now, about a day prior, you start a massive naval bombardment of Haiphong, and when the mech forces reach Hanoi, an artillery bombardment and a continued Air Force bombardment. You launch special operations missions to secure drop zones, landing zones, airstrips. You also raid key targets. You send in the Navy SEALs, also raiding key targets. You launch an airborne operation and drop the 101st and the 82nd Airborne Division outside of Hanoi. You drop the 173rd Airborne Brigade between Hanoi and Haiphong to set up a blocking force. And then after the naval bombardment, you launch a full-scale assault by the 1st Marine Division into Haiphong. Bang. And I guarantee you, within 2 weeks, North Vietnam would be toast. Now, I say this, it's a moot point because you have to ask the more important questions. First of all, should we have ever gotten involved in in the Vietnam War in the first place? Well, I say again, given the politics of the Cold War, it was probably unavoidable. 1961, we went through the Cuban Missile Crisis. All across the globe, there were tons of insurgencies springing up backed by the Soviet Union and the Chinese. So, secondly, the next question is, were we prepared to commit to winning in Vietnam? And that's probably the most key question, because as everything turned out, we were not. We were not committed to risk maybe a potential conflict with China or Russia or over Vietnam. And had we invaded North Vietnam and taken control, there is definitely, in my opinion, possibility that China might have done the same thing they did in Korea. So I say it's a moot point because the U.S. at the time did not have the will or the commitment to save South Vietnam or to win the war in Vietnam. And in the end, that's the real question. Now let's go to lessons. And let's talk about, like I mentioned before, militarily, we owned the North Vietnamese army. I mean, we did. We kicked their butts constantly, up and down, every time we did. We fought a successful guerrilla war. That's been proven. That's not an issue. The issue has always been politically, was the U.S. resolve there to win in the Vietnam War? No, it was not. Now, we have steadfastly defended South Korea and have never buckled. We have challenged North Korea every chance we've had, other than the moron Bill Clinton, who signed some absurd agreement which basically allowed North Korea to acquire a nuclear capability. But then I guess that's just one of those things that's a constant with Democratic presidents who are ignorant and don't understand foreign policy and seem to, think that the other side's going to honor their agreements despite whatever, apologies or statements they make. So fast forward now, Vietnam, ironically, has moved over the years towards capitalism. They have supported U.S. corporations in clothing, footwear, etc. And this is the great irony, because they pushed a communist government, yet they ended up falling back. They ended up advancing a capitalist economy to help themselves. And this is the hilarious part, because despite their communist agenda, they literally ended up now trying to push a capitalist economy to boost their economy, and basically got in bed with the U.S. corporations. Nike, I could go on and on. I mean, that is the greatest irony in all of this. So I'll make a quick comment about lessons from Vietnam. Now, what did we learn? Okay, one, you could say, should we have ever gotten involved in the first place? And I already covered that. Secondly, if you're going to fight and you decide it's worth fighting, fight to win. It's that simple. If you're not going to fight to win, don't fight. And this is a lesson, and I'm going to cover this later because I've got to address the idiot Tim Horn's comments about Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm going to cover that in a podcast in the future where he was so far off it wasn't even funny. In fact, it was almost pathetic. His unsupported comments and suppositions. I mean, it was total nonsense. But for instance, if you're going to fight to win. And I'm just going to briefly say, okay, in Iraq, we fought, we won. The surge in 2007, success, stable country, and then, much like Vietnam, what happened when Obama decided he's going to use the SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement, as an excuse, even though he completely ignored the fact that there was a provision in there to allow the stay of U.S. troops given on the security condition and the situation indefinitely, and he bailed on Iraq. We even had a pro-U.S. Iraqi president in al-Abadi who begged Obama not to pull out, and the moron pulled out anyway, even stuck his foot farther in his mouth by calling ISIS the JV team. And again, I bring up the surge 2007. That worked and annihilated for the most part AQSM, except for those that fled across into Syria and ended up uniting with several Sunni Syrian rebel movements, formed the core of ISIS. And then by 2014, ISIS controlled 1/3 of the country of Iraq in the north. And what ended up? Obama realized his screw up, had to go back in, and we're basically trying to fix a screw up by an idiot president who failed to recognize history, who failed to listen to the CIA, to his military commanders, to everybody who told him the impending threat, much like what happened in Vietnam in 1973, when we completely pulled out and nobody listened, nobody paid attention, and the fall of Saigon and South Vietnam happened. At least at this point, we're fighting to preserve Iraq. The sad part, I say again, is that all of this could have been averted had we just paid attention to history, stayed in Iraq, defended the border between Iraq and Syria, continued to support the Kurds, and probably none of this would have been going on today, as in having to retake Mosul and everything that's happened from 2014 to present day. Okay, this is Mac Bolan. I say again, I took it slow. I hope everybody listened. Now, I know there are probably veterans, Vietnam veterans, and actually some of my own recent veteran friends that will disagree with some of the things I've said here, and that's fine. I've presented facts, my opinion, based on facts. And as I say again, in the future, I'm going to go ahead and do a podcast covering both Iraq and Afghanistan. Again, I feel compelled because of the video that I saw on YouTube by this guy, Tim Horn. And please, by all means, check out his video that I'm talking about on YouTube. Please, I will, and watch it, see what he said, see what I'm saying. And I threw down the gauntlet. I told this guy I will openly debate him any time he wants. So, again, this is Mac Bolan, podcast on Vietnam, the war, Cambodia, Laos, Southeast Asia. Hope you enjoyed it, everybody. Feel free to comment in the comment sections below, and I'll catch you on the next one. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope it was informative. Have a good night, and God bless you all, and God bless America and God bless the troops.